housing bubble is time to pop. Redfin suggests that 60% and more are buying houses without ever seeing them. Housing prices are out of control. Double-digit annual appreciation. Crazy cash offers, waiving inspections. Multiple offers are happening. Something has to give, right? Well, what this video is going to talk to you is the housing bubble, and specifically Fort Collins, Colorado. What's up, everybody? This is Patrick Soukup with Soukup Real Estate Services here in Fort Collins, Colorado. And if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing if what you're looking at doing is learning everything Fort Collins and Northern Colorado. Eating, sleeping, playing, working, whatever you name it, I got your back when it comes to Fort Collins. And as much as I like making these real estate videos for YouTube, we like more working with buyers, sellers, and investors for all their real estate needs here in Northern Colorado and Fort Collins. Send me a text, email, call, whatever works for you. I've got your back when it comes to all your real estate needs in Northern Colorado and Fort Collins. Without any further delay, let's jump into the housing bubble in Fort Collins, Colorado. Enjoy. So what are some of the risks of a bubble? Well, interest rates could spike. Now, Jerome Powell is suggesting that he's going to keep rates low until he sees some of those unemployment numbers get better. And what is spiking? Right now, we're about 3% for a 30-year fixed. Is that 4%, 5%? When does that number come to a point where prices have to stabilize because the affordability of a monthly mortgage is no longer affordable? So interest rates spiking could lead to a decreased demand in buying and therefore a glut supply coming on, and people that had bought at a price point that made sense at 3% no longer makes sense at 5%, may need to sell for whatever reason and has to take a wash or a bath. And so a flood of homes come on the market at a price point that doesn't make sense. People have to sell underwater. So there's a potential bubble. Mortgage forbearance. Well, yeah, there was an opportunity for buyers or owners of homes who had a loan on their property to take forbearance, to basically not pay their mortgage. And then it came to be that loan payment just got tacked on to the back end of the mortgage, and they didn't have to do any type of penalties or anything like that. But essentially we were able to take mortgages for free. And the reason why you would do that is if you had lost a job and not able to afford your loan. Now, you didn't have to supply any documentation saying that you had hardship. You had to attest that you had hardship, but there was no documentation required. And so what percentage of those people that took mortgage forbearance actually needed it? Or were some people just taking a loan holiday? Well, as of right now, we are at half the number of mortgage forbearance, the total number of mortgage forbearance loans that we had at the peak of 2020, according to Housing Wire. So those individuals have removed themselves from mortgage forbearance, and you could have extended. And so it's not that they necessarily had to, it's that they voluntarily have removed to continue paying their loan. Whether they've got their job back or want to start paying down their mortgage for whatever reason, at this point we are at half the number. Now, those numbers could, at this point, potentially go through a default loan and foreclosure, and therefore the other half, millions of loans that are in forbearance goes through eviction, and you have this glut of supply come onto the market in the form of evictions, which is what we saw in 2008 and 9, where people weren't able to afford their loans, their payments. They started defaulting because their incomes weren't what they stated their incomes to be, and all this property came onto the market, and we had a great recession. So mortgage forbearance, those numbers, if they come onto the market in this huge glut, potential housing bubble. And two other risks could be, well, we had this huge vacate of the major metros, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, New York City, and into the suburbs where people could spread out, work from home, virtual, remote work, all that good stuff. Well, we're starting to open back up, and maybe these people really miss out on walking to their favorite cafe out the bottom of their apartment building downtown, and then being able to go sit and talk and see hundreds of thousands of people out their doorstep and have all the nightclubs. So they make a return back to these major metros, or places like Google and Facebook and different big tech giants say, you know what, it's great, we're gonna allow you to remote work, but we're gonna ask that you start coming back, and so therefore that virtual remote working is no longer gonna happen. Come on back home to California or Chicago. And this is kind of a long tail of a potential housing bubble, but maybe our supply increases in these secondary suburb type cities such as Fort Collins, Colorado. And we have these builders that just put full steam ahead and build as much as they frickin' can, because the amount of people that are pouring into our city just demands that type of housing. And well, oh, sorry, we're out back to Chicago, and now you guys are stuck with a ton of extra housing that you don't necessarily need. And well, now you guys got a supply surplus and a demand that doesn't necessarily meet it. Prices are gonna have to come down to meet that, so housing bubble. There's another risk. And finally, the last risk is an eviction crisis. Well, right now we're just starting to get back into the game of evictions. People respond to carrots and sticks, in my opinion. Carrot, you're gonna go get a job promotion. You're gonna work your butt off because at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel is you get a job promotion. Stick, well, this is for renting. If you don't pay your rent, you get a late fee. And if you don't pay your rent and you don't pay your late fees, you get evicted. Well, for the last 14 months, we have not been able to do evictions. So there's potentially tons of people. I've got a rental myself where there's somebody who owes $5,000 in back rent, and we just posted him for eviction for the first time. We'd love to work out a plan with him. We'd love to get him to be able to pay his rent and him to be able to stay there. But for the last 14 months, he didn't necessarily have any reason to pay his rent because, well, I couldn't do anything. And what if this is just a small sample size of a much grander problem, and these landlords finally are able to evict these tenants. These tenants can't find housing because they don't have the jobs, because the unemployment numbers are extremely high. They go live in with mom and dad, or multi-family housing, and the demand for housing rentals decreases. Those rental properties get sold because there's either not enough demand or those owners have enough equity. They're just saying, screw it, I'm out. And so you have a lack of demand in the rental market because people are living multi-generational living opportunities because they can't afford or can't qualify to rent. And these landlords say, screw it, if I can't get my rental done, I'm gonna sell my house. So we have this huge wave of properties that come onto the market and a huge surplus of supply. So your supply is gonna be here and your demand is gonna be here, price is gonna have to come down, housing bubble. So those are the 4 risks that I see as a potential housing bubble that could impact what prices are currently doing. Now, where do I think we're actually going and what do I think is actually happening is kind of hedges all of that. So specifically at Fort Collins, our population is increasing about 1 to 2% a year, roughly right around 1.5%, or about 2,000 to 3,000 people a year. That's gonna be a huge indicator of our housing demand. If we see that population stabilize, stagnate, or decline, yeah, I would say there's a potential that our building of new construction, housing permits, housing starts, all of those are 12 to 18 months down the road for the start and completion of those processes. And those houses are gonna get built. They've already been paid for essentially, and they're gonna be built, and the demand is going to decrease, and population, if it stagnates or declines, won't be able to absorb those housing units. But our population is not declining. It's increasing at about 1.5% each year. And according to Inman, there needs to be about 3.8 million houses built to supply the demand that is currently there. And according to the US Department of Commerce, only about 1.7 million houses each year are being built. So we're about half of what is needed, which then leads me directly to supply. Currently, as of April, we had 112 homes on the market in Fort Collins, or about a half month's supply. Historically speaking, we are seeing about a 6-month supply for a healthy market. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily attainable. And going back as far as 2007, we had about 1,400 houses on the market. So we had 14 times as much houses as we did at this time. Now, that continually decreased as we've gotten into this kind of housing extravaganza. And in 2012, we only had about 600 houses on the market. So about 6 times what we have right now. So inventory being at the levels that it's at, even if we had some of those risk factors, mortgage forbearance, interest rate spikes, eviction crisis, people flocking the area back to their major metros, inventory would have to increase 6 to 12 times for it to just become a more level market. After we exceed that, yes, there are risks of a housing crisis, but right now, we just need the extra homes so that we can actually have buyers move into them and not compete like crazy. In 2007, we had a crazy market. Between 2000 and 2007, bankers were giving out loans like candy. I talked with the vice president of a bank down in Texas, and this was back in 2010 or 11, post the housing crisis, but still very fresh in everybody's mind. And this vice president said that he would walk around with pre-approval slips in his jacket pocket, basically just handing them out. I can tell you that that is absolutely not the case. I, for one, am extremely well qualified to buy a house. And I, on the day of my refinance on my personal home, had to extend my closing from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. because they wanted to verify 2 of my transactions within the last 10 days. Now, I'm self-employed, and so the bankers and lenders don't necessarily love self-employed people, but I can tell you my credit score is extremely high and my income is solid, and they verified everything 3 times over. So those securities of houses that don't necessarily, or people who can't necessarily afford them, 0% down, and other items that caused this purchase of a house without the ability to afford it on a monthly basis, 0% down. And if they had any inkling of a decrease, it would just make more sense for them to walk away. They didn't have any equity. They didn't have any risk. So just walk away. Well, according to CoreLogic, the average homeowner right now has $200,000 worth of equity in their house. $200,000. So that means they're going to stay in that house. They're going to sell it. They'll figure out a way if they lose their job and they can't afford the monthly payments, even if they have to take a haircut on the price of their home, they have a wiggle room of $200,000. Here are some numbers for you for Fort Collins, for example. In 2019, median price was $436, 2020, $462, and 2021, $529. So the median priced home could take a $100,000 haircut and they'd still walk away about even if they bought in the last 2 years. That was not the case in 2006 and 7. They were underwater and couldn't afford the mortgage and had to sell. So short sale or foreclosures flooded the market. And here we are, us millennials, I'm one of them, are finally entering the home buying stage of our lives. Getting married, having kids, and having the financial ability, whether it's having paid down some of the college debt that we may have acquired, or our incomes increased to a point that now makes financial sense to us to buy a home, but we are now finally entering the home buying market. The largest generation, 70 million plus people entering that phase of their life where they want to own a home. So if we're talking about historical rates of 63 to 65% home ownership of that 70 million, well, roughly about 35 to 40 million people just are entering the market to buy homes. So it's simple supply demand, largest generation in history entering their home buying phase of their life. And now this one's specific to Fort Collins. We are landlocked. As much as properties on Hawaii are extremely expensive because they're surrounded by water and there's literally no place to grow. Well, Fort Collins is similar. Along our west, we have the foothills. To the north, Wellington, south, Loveland, east, Timnath, and Windsor. There is only a limited amount of infill opportunities in Fort Collins, Colorado. And like anything, it's pure scarcity equals a price increase. If there's just not enough of it and there's a strong enough demand, the price is going to increase to a point that the demand is satiated because the amount of people who can afford to buy are doing that. And until that point, prices will continue to increase. So simple as far as price increase, not necessarily, indicative of a housing bubble, but we are a population that's increasing, landlocked. Millennials are entering, there's not enough supply, home builders can't keep up. So all 5 of those things are extremely important when we're considering, is there a possibility of a housing crisis? Now, let's look at an example of if we did have a housing crisis, what that looks like monetarily, financially to you. Now, I think it's also important to realize that Fort Collins was just ranked as the #1 place to live in 2020. And it was also ranked as one of the top 10 places to live for the digital nomads or people who are remote working. So as long as those continue to come out and people have the interest and desire to live in Fort Collins, I believe that the demand to live in Fort Collins in northern Colorado will overcome any type of housing correction. Now, it was a very good place to live and listed as top places to live back in 2007 and 8. And so we didn't necessarily get hit nearly as hard as the Floridas or Arizonas when this crisis happened. Specifically in 2008, we went down about 1%. In 2009, we went down 3%. And then we had a steady incline of appreciation of 2%, 2.5%, 3%, and then jumped up back to our 6%, and then had some years of our 10, 12, and 2013, 14s that were very strong years for home appreciation here in Fort Collins. And that being said, what would it look like if you bought a house the day before a crash began in Fort Collins? If you looked at the exact same scenario that went down 1%, 3%, and then only had a small increase from there, and suggesting that you bought about 10% above market to begin with, because what I'm seeing here on houses as far as bidding is anywhere from 3 to 7% in a healthy bidding war and anywhere from 10 to 20% in some crazy houses. So if you bought a house that was listed for $425,000, that you bid on for $465,000, and the next day, well, news comes out that mortgage forbearance is in fact a massive issue and there is going to be a glut of supply coming onto the market. Let's have a look at what that might look like. So if you buy in year 1 at a 10% premium, and in fact the house was truly only worth $425,000, and the next 2 years went down 1%, 3%, and following years went up 2, 2.5%, 3%, 6%. It's going to take you until year 7 for your home value to eclipse the price that you bought it for. Now, that's not necessarily the whole story, because when you buy a house, each month when you're paying your mortgage, a portion of your payment goes to pay down principal. So you would be getting some equity into that house in the form of principal pay down. So even though at the end of year 7, you're just a little slightly above that original price point of $465,000, your home value's in that $470s, but you actually have about $80,000 worth of equity in that home. Now, if you were to have rented for those 7 years and paying about $1,900, you'd have a little over $150,000 that you've spent on rent. And then conversely, that mortgage that you would have bought for $465,000 with 5% down, PMI, principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and PMI, your payment would be about $2,400 a month, or over 7 years, about $202,000. So it is gonna cost you about $60,000 more to buy than it would to rent. Now, At the end of year 7, you're gonna have about 80,000 plus in equity. So you are in fact going to have $20,000 more than you would if you would have rented. Now, what if you invested that $40,000 to $60,000 into the stocks? Now, if you invested into cryptocurrency, sure, you're either going to the moon or you're going to the graveyard. But either way, if you went a little bit more secure, went in a stock market, what could you do with that $40,000 that you invested rather than bought a home? And that's not necessarily fair, because that's saying you had all $40,000 at the beginning of year 1. In reality, you're gonna just be saving that on a monthly basis, so investing that. And so if you actually did have this big chunk of change at the beginning, that $40,000 would increase, let's just say 7%. It would increase to a point that made it closer. Your equity versus that number are gonna be a tad closer. But that still isn't necessarily the whole story, because that $425,000 house or $465,000 house is now gonna be in the mid 600s for you to buy in year 7 if Fort Collins does in fact increase at its expected 5.5% annually. Now, if you were to look at Redfin just recently, they suggested that in 2021, we're gonna see about 11 to 12% appreciation gain. So that affordability factor continues to get pushed out further and further and further. So it's the old saying, best time to buy a tree is 20 years ago. Next best time is today. Now, to hedge some of those fears, some of those insecurities about the housing market is, can you afford the mortgage for the next 3 to 5 years? Put as much down as you feel comfortable with, but at least 3 to 5% so that you're going into it with some skin in the game. You feel the need to stay there. And if your mortgage is going to be attainable and affordable for the next 3 to 5 years, you'll be at least able to weather the storm if in fact a housing crisis came to Fort Collins, Colorado. Now, I don't think that's gonna happen. Obviously, I've told you guys about the population growth, digital nomads living here, new construction just isn't able to stick up. Our inventory is extremely low. Interest rates currently are extremely at historic lows, and all of the other reasons that we discussed. There are absolutely risks of a housing crisis. Sure, Flint, Michigan didn't realize that they were gonna not be able to drink their water and housing prices there, well, go take a look. And of course, something like that might be able to happen in Fort Collins. Maybe there's some noxious gases in our mountains that we just now realize because of however. And if something like that happens, well, yeah, I'll be starting over in some other area and starting from scratch or in a big, very, very big negative. That would be for sure. So I hope this video helps you understand some of the risks, some of the ideas, the conversations that I'm having with people about a housing crisis, whether or not that they should wait and wait it out, and hopefully some of this information helps you. I'm not to say that there are not risks, but there are also things to consider about what is actually happening and some of the statistics behind it when making those final decisions. So if buying a house, investing in a home or a property, or moving to Fort Collins is of interest to you and you want to be a part of the home buying process and get some equity going, feel free to reach out to me, ask questions, engage, send me a text, email, whatever it is. I've got your back, all things here in Northern Colorado and Fort Collins. Until next time, guys, take care.